Welcome to the first Friday coffee break with the Community Indicators Consortium. CIC is a central knowledge and organizational hub for community indicators projects, helping to advance and support measurable, equitable, and sustainable improvements in the quality of community life. I am Marty Romiti, Managing Director for CIC, and on the first Friday of each month, we take a short break from our day to learn about the latest projects, data tools, and key issues happening in the world of community indicators. This month, we hear from Sonak Patel on the City of Calgary, Canada's climate risk profiles. Acknowledging that climate change risk is unequally distributed, both geographically and socially, the City of Calgary is engaging in work to understand how climate hazards will uniquely impact communities in Calgary. Sonak recently presented at CIC's Methods, Metrics, and Measurement Symposium, where he discussed the development of climate risk profiles, which report the specific drivers of climate risk in each of Calgary's communities. The presentation discusses both methods and metrics for these data sets and how the climate risk profiles are being used to support efficient and effective climate adaptation investment and policies.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this presentation. My name is Sonak Patel. I work at the City of Calgary on the Climate Adaptation team, and I'm going to talk to you about our work on understanding community-scale climate risk and the community climate risk profiles. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the City of Calgary is located on Treaty 7 territory, the traditional homelands of many Indigenous groups, including the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations of the Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. Not just confined to history, the City of Calgary continues to be the home and gathering space of many Indigenous and Métis people who call this place home. I'll be talking about our Community Climate Risk Profile project here at the City of Calgary. I'll outline the gap that they fill, what indicators we use to create these profiles, and how we are using them to build climate resilience in Calgary. Calgary has and will continue to face a variety of climate change-induced hazards, including extreme heat, higher average temperatures, river floods, and heavy rainfall. The community climate risk profiles acknowledge that everyone will be affected by climate change, but not everyone will be impacted equally. The changing climate is already and will continue to intersect with a widespread variety of factors, including social, geographic, economic, cultural, and otherwise, and determine how people will be impacted by climate change. Acknowledging these differences is the crux of vulnerability-driven approaches to understanding climate risk, aligning with international research and best practices. Understanding what is driving risk is critical to our work at the city. With limited time and resources available for climate adaptation, we need to target approaches and measures to the largest sources of risk within each community to most efficiently foster climate resilience. The community climate risk profiles examine how the geographic communities of Calgary are uniquely exposed and vulnerable to climate change hazards. To do so, the reports combine multiple datasets and indicators, including a risk index, heat mapping, natural asset mapping, and equity indicators. And I'll walk through what each of those are. The first and most substantial contributor to the profiles is the Community Climate Risk Index, a massive dataset of factors that assess climate risk information that we commissioned from our consultant WSP. Through this index, the City of Calgary joins other jurisdictions that have developed geospatial indices. Informed by a review of risk and resilience indices and approaches, the CCRI views climate risk as an intersection of climate hazard characteristics, exposure to these climate hazards, and vulnerability within social, built, and natural systems. The dataset examines climate risk presently and projected out to 2050 using socioeconomic and climate science data. Communities are given a climate risk score for both time periods that reflects the climate risk relative to the other communities in the city. The CCRI, that's the Community Climate Risk Index, identifies 6 hazards for inclusion in analysis. Meteorological drought is defined as a period over 2 weeks with little precipitation and will rise in frequency from twice a century to once a decade. Extreme heat events are one of the highest risks in the future time period, with extreme heat events becoming frequent enough that they occur multiple times in a single year. Higher average temperatures describe the slow onset risks of gradually rising temperature, like ecosystem shifts and long-term wear on infrastructure, and is one of the highest risks in the present time period, because there has already been a noticeable increase in temperatures in Calgary since pre-industrial times. Severe storms include strong winds, lightning, and hail, which can damage built and natural infrastructure in Calgary. Severe storms will rise in frequency to occur more than once a year by mid-century. With Calgary located at the intersection of two rivers, river floods are also going to rise in frequency because of climate change, damaging areas within the floodplain. Climate change will also affect the precipitation patterns in Calgary, causing more rain to fall in shorter periods of time and increasing the likelihood of flooding. Climate hazard likelihood is intersected with exposure, or how many community assets are exposed to climate change. Indicators are separated into three systems: the people in a community, the amount of buildings and paved spaces in a community, and the natural areas in a community. We use growth projections to measure how exposure will change by 2050. Vulnerability is based on antecedent conditions in the three systems that affect how they are adversely affected by a climate hazard. We have two types of vulnerability: sensitivity, which are the indicators that determine how much a community is impacted by climate change, and adaptive capacity, the indicators that affect a system's ability to respond, recover, and change in response to or in anticipation of climate hazards. Because of the complexity of vulnerability indicators, we cannot predict what vulnerability will look like in the future. So we assume that vulnerability is constant to predict future climate risk. Let's talk about the indicators in the social system. On the sensitivity side, the indicators we use to determine how vulnerable community members are to being harmed by climate change include age. The elderly and very young are especially vulnerable to health impacts from climate hazards like extreme heat, flooding, and severe storms. These community members may also require mobility support during climate hazard events like evacuations. Visible minorities. Research shows that racialized minorities experience higher vulnerability to climate hazards due to disproportionately lower socioeconomic and housing conditions. People of color can experience challenges to accessing resources and supports due to discriminatory and racial barriers. Indigenous community members, similar to the challenges facing visible minorities, Indigenous populations can face institutional and societal challenges to accessing resources and supports, as well as disproportionately lower socioeconomic conditions. In affecting traditional areas and gathering places where the city of Calgary now sits, climate change will also affect traditional practices, lifestyles, and cultural places. The impacts of climate change on Indigenous community members prescribes the need for Indigenous input and consideration in all climate adaptation work. Single-person households. The research showed that single-person households are more vulnerable as they are more likely to have fewer financial resources and social connections than larger households. Single-person households can also exacerbate health challenges. Think of a single-person household during a heat wave. If they live alone, they may not be able to recognize the early signs of heat stroke and may not be able to get medical help right away. Creating check-in systems can help reduce the risks for people who do live alone. One-parent families are also vulnerable because they are less likely to have as many financial and social supports as two-parent families. It can also be difficult to find the time and resources to prepare and recover from climate impacts if the sole parent is responsible for all child care responsibilities. This vulnerability also prescribes the need for child-focused policies, like providing shade and water access at playgrounds, and the benefits of providing childcare at city engagement events to encourage participation in climate adaptation planning. International disaster research also shows a gender difference, where women are more likely to experience harm from climate hazards, such as greater impacts on life expectancy, unemployment, delayed re-entry to the labor force, and asset loss. Gender-based violence can also be exacerbated by slow onset hazards. and pregnant women are also at risk of health issues during climate emergencies. These vulnerabilities suggest the need for gender equity lens in our climate adaptation work. Adaptive capacity indicators demonstrate how community members can prepare for and adapt to climate change hazards. Social system adaptive capacity indicators include newcomers to the community who may have less ability to prepare and recover from climate change because they have fewer social connections and less awareness of the climate risks they will experience in their community or local climate resilience resources. Recent immigrants and non-permanent community members face similar challenges, but these can sometimes be compounded with possible challenges of being visible minorities or potential language barriers. Being unfamiliar with English or French can be a major challenge, as community members experiencing the harms of climate change can struggle to communicate their experience and to access climate adaptation resources and information available. The research also showed that education rates are associated with lower health, less economic resilience, and less ability to communicate and understand information, affecting their ability to prepare and respond to climate change. And looking at income, we have two indicators, both the number of low-income community members and high-income community members. Low-income community members have fewer financial resources available to prepare and respond to climate change, and vice versa for high-income community members. Communities with high numbers of relatively low-income community members or few high-income community members may require more financial supports to engage in climate adaptation. We also look at the intersection between low incomes and the elderly population. As discussed earlier, the elderly can experience exacerbated health impacts, and low-income elderly community members may have fewer resources to offset those sensitivities. Looking at unemployment, similar to low-income community members, unemployed community members may have fewer financial resources available that can be used for climate adaptation, and are also less likely to have health insurance, increasing the risk of adverse health impacts from climate change. And finally, the number of transit stops is used to assess transit accessibility. More mobility options increases the ability of community members to travel and provides climate resilience. So as you can see, many of our social indicators are assumptive and research-based. It's not necessarily true that any member within one of these groups has more vulnerability than any one person outside of that group, but rather these are trends across the population. The limitation of assumption-based research suggests the need for more detailed risk assessment with community engagement to move from research-driven assumptions to understanding the real social vulnerability in a community. Of course, our goal is not to change the demographics of a community. We don't want to, say, remove elderly people from a community to improve climate risk scores. Rather, we use this information to inform and guide the programs and policies in each community so that we can best support the community members. Looking at the built system, we use the following indicators for sensitivity. Amount of paved land itself is used to calculate the sensitivity of the community, as paved spaces increase temperatures and reduce permeability, increasing the risk of flooding. Older homes are more susceptible to higher indoor temperatures during extreme heat events and are more susceptible to damage from climate change hazards like wind and hail. Similarly, we look at housing in need of major repairs as a sensitivity, as these homes are vulnerable to further climate damage. Retrofitting homes in poor condition and older homes is an opportunity to improve climate resilience. Average city facilities condition. We also look at the state of municipal facilities, as facilities that are in poor condition are vulnerable to further damage, affecting the continuity of city services, presenting a risk to municipal employees, and creating an economic liability in the city. Pavement condition. We examine the state of roads and sidewalks as two separate indicators, and we include this indicator as pavement in poor condition is vulnerable to further damage from climate change. Deteriorated pavements can damage automobiles and be a substantial cost to replace. Average bridge condition is also included because climate change can damage bridges, challenging evacuations, and cutting off connections between communities. The age of stormwater infrastructure is also used for built system vulnerability, as older stormwater infrastructure is more vulnerable to climate change damage and is typically designed with less capacity than climate change-induced heavy rainfall events will bring. The built system does not have any adaptive capacity indicators. Turning finally to the natural system, we looked at factors that affected the likelihood of natural areas being damaged and recovering from climate impacts. On the sensitivity side, we considered indicators like the amount of natural areas that can be impacted by climate change, which is creating favorable conditions for invasive species, stressing plants and animals during extreme heat and drought events, and damaging vegetation during severe storms. The average public tree condition rating, which evaluates the health of trees in the community, is also a sensitivity indicator. Trees in poor health are more likely to be damaged by climate change. The loss of trees can cause the loss of key ecosystem services, impact the wildlife that relies on them, and create a cost to the city. Park irrigation requirements, with droughts being one of the hazards induced by climate change, parks with high irrigation requirements may face significant risks during drought events and water restrictions. Water demand increase in summer is also used as a drought vulnerability measure, estimating the vulnerability to drought within a community. For communities with riparian areas, the CCRI examines how these areas are managed, as certain management zones were determined to be more sensitive to climate change harm. And underperforming parks. Parks in poor condition are more susceptible to climate change damage. Examining the adaptive capacity indicators in the natural system, we use riparian health scores for communities with these areas, as healthy natural riparian areas are better able to recover from climate change impacts. We also use the Human Disturbance Index to estimate how much humans have disturbed or damaged natural areas, as damaged natural areas have a reduced resilience to climate change. And finally, the indicator of tree canopy area serves both to increase and decrease vulnerability. While more trees in the community create more opportunities for climate change to damage them, these trees also provide resilience benefits in the social system, like providing cooling through shade and respiration, windbreaks, and air purification. Using all of these indicators, the CCRI calculates the present and future risk scores, which are ranked from very low to very high, to show how at risk a community is relative to the other communities in Calgary. And in most communities, we see climate risk rise by at least one rank by mid-century, demonstrating the scale of the climate challenge that's facing Calgary. To support the CCRI data, the climate risk profiles also conduct an analysis of the urban heat island effect in each community. The urban heat island effect is a phenomenon where urban areas are warmer than rural or natural spaces, because paved spaces hold heat better than natural spaces, because vegetation creates a cooling effect, and because of the waste heat produced by cars and buildings. The City of Calgary commissioned the creation of an urban heat island map, using satellite data to understand what parts of a community are warmer than others, often aligning with large, contiguous paved and built spaces, like dense developments or paved surface parking lots. Understanding the warmest parts of a community is critical to targeting cooling infrastructure where it's most needed. We're also working with our consultants and internal resources to further develop the tool and overcome the limitations of the existing methods, such as challenges identifying the difference between air and surface temperatures and accounting for the effect of shadows cast by tall buildings at the time that the satellite data was captured. Future opportunities include using this tool as a predictive tool for future development and future climate conditions. The community climate risk profiles also analyze the distribution of natural areas in the community, identifying natural areas like grasslands, forests, riparian land, and shrubland. We also label green spaces and park spaces. Natural areas provide a large number of resilience benefits, like being a refuge during extreme heat events, providing permeable land that can absorb rainfall, and reducing the odds of rain overwhelming stormwater infrastructure. Edible landscaping and community gardens can also provide food resilience. Understanding how many natural assets are in a community is therefore necessary to understand climate risk in a community. Another crucial part of the natural asset map is to understand the distribution of green spaces in a community. If natural areas are concentrated in a specific part of that neighborhood, community members distant from these green spaces can face higher climate risk. The final dataset included in the climate risk profiles is an analysis of the Calgary Equity Index, This index uses 17 indicators in 5 categories: population health, economic opportunity, civic engagement, human and social development, and physical environment and infrastructure. Acknowledging that climate change will exacerbate existing inequities, we examine which indicators are performing at, above, or below target levels. We then determine how these indicators may impact climate risk. For example, poor performance and economic opportunity suggests the need for financial incentives and supports to get community buy-in from lower income community members. Through these profiles, we develop an idea of how climate change will affect each community and why. We are using this information to guide our community planning and public investment projects. This information is being used in our land use plans to inform policies that address the greatest sources of risk. For example, in a recent redevelopment plan, we recommended adding street trees in the warmest parts of the community, as seen in the urban heat island map. You can see a few more examples of ways that we've used this information on the slide. We also use this information to guide our public investments. As we consider multiple public realm improvement projects for a limited pool of funding, the climate risk profiles have been used to assess these projects for their impact, whether positive or negative, on climate resilience as a criteria for investment. We also use the climate risk profiles to suggest opportunities to add better climate resilience considerations to projects. For example, like encouraging more permeable areas in a bike lane redevelopment for a community with a substantial amount of paved space. The community climate risk profiles are a critical piece of work for the city. With the limited resources available compared to the massive scale of work required to foster climate resilience, these community climate risk profiles allow us to target our resources and policies to the greatest sources of risk in each community. I hope this presentation helps show the methods we use to assess community scale climate risk information. Some of the key takeaways from the project include the importance of acknowledging the inequity and inequality of climate change risk between community members and between communities, and the need to consider these differences when planning for climate resilience and making climate resilient investments. Understanding community climate risk requires understanding the multiple systems that form a community, including people, places, and valued assets. All these systems interact with each other and intersect with climate risk and the indicators discussed. Our future directions for this project include developing a companion toolkit that contains climate adaptation policies that can be included in land use plans that address the biggest climate risks in a community, as determined by the community climate risk profiles. We are also looking at refining our indicators and data sources, especially in the social system, using community engagement to move beyond assumptions and broad generalizations to realistic understandings of social system climate risk. Amending the climate risk profiles for other jurisdictions requires a substantial amount of data to create the necessary inputs. Among the data needs for the community include understanding local climate hazards and how they will change in the future. This process also requires understanding what indicators in the community intersect with those locally relevant climate hazards. With those indicators established, the largest task is finding where data comes from for each indicator. Our data mostly came from internal business units, such as census data managed by Calgary Neighborhoods and park condition data from Calgary Parks. So thank you very much for your time and attention. For more information about the climate change work at the City of Calgary, please visit our webpage. Thank you.